Una consulta, ¿cómo cuantifica los problemas cuando, digamos, la línea de base es insuficiente? ¿A qué se refiere con cuantificar y qué metodología utilizaría?
That's a very good question. In some cases, things are going to be quantifiable. In other cases, they're not. And we'll talk about that in a little while when we start talking about data and information. It's a very good point. So, transboundary diagnostic analysis, identifying and prioritising the transboundary problems, analysing the environmental impacts and socio-economic consequences of each problem, analysing the causes for each transboundary problem, and then analysing the laws, institutions, policies and projected investments. They're the kind of cornerstones of the TDA-SAP, of the TDA.
Martín, justo discutíamos en el intermedio con unos colegas sobre cuantificar o no estos problemas. Tal vez el detalle es cómo hacemos ese traspaso de información para a la vez cuantificarlo. Es decir, ¿no?, entre los actores locales y esa comunicación, ¿no?, generalmente, no siempre está bien representada, tal vez cuando solo se reúnen los científicos o cuando se reúnen inclusive con gente del gobierno, porque no hay un adecuado traspaso de información de esos problemas o de esas prioridades. No sé si me dejo entender.
Traspaso como
Sí,
una metodología.
¿Cómo podemos traspasar realmente esa información de esas prioridades, de esos problemas? No sé.
Do you mean pass the information from here through to the different stakeholders? Yeah, we'll talk about that. Again, a very good question. We will talk about this over the next 2 or 3 days. How do you translate what can be often quite complicated and quite difficult information into a format that artisanal fisher folk can actually understand or comment on? Do they feel this is right or wrong? It's absolutely important, absolutely. But we'll talk about that.
En la misma línea que la pregunta de Michelle, el problema es de estar organizado en un país de varios que comparten el ecosistema. Puede que el problema en sí no sea nacional porque no estamos compartiendo, pero puede ser global, dada su implicancia. Entonces, en ese sentido, ¿cierto?, caería. Pero si no lo hay, entonces es un tema interno nomás del país y el país no se hace cargo, eso es. Porque esto lo que estamos viendo acá es lo que tiene financiamiento del IKEA. Pero si ese problema es de importancia para el país y no tiene otra connotación, pues el problema es solamente el país hace cargo de eso es.
Yeah, from the point of view of Jeff is looking at future funding of projects that are transboundary. So in essence, the transboundary diagnostic analysis, it says it's transboundary. So it's looking at what are the problems that are transboundary, what are the impacts or the causes, and what are some potential solutions. But at the same time, and we'll cover this, there are going to be a number of issues that might not be transboundary, they might be shared. So they might be shared between both countries, but there's not a crossover between one and the other. And there are also going to be other problems that are going to be specific to a country. But Jeff is not going to be particularly interested in funding them through or providing further financial support through an implementation phase for national priorities per se. But it's important that they're not lost, because sometimes these are fundamentally important, and it might be that they get picked up at the country level for some form of country intervention or from some other donor. I think the important is to capture all this information and then present it in such a way in the TDA document that it's available to all. Okay?
Estratégica o metodológicamente para lograr esto del TDA, ¿es preferible que cada país haga un análisis primero de sus problemáticas y luego las exponga y busquen conjunciones, o es estratégicamente mejor que ambos países en este caso se junten e identifiquen los problemas? ¿Cuál es la mejor forma?
Oh, you're jumping ahead here. We'll cover all this. We will. A quick answer is both ways have been done. Both ways have had good successes and failures. And if you ask me, personally, I think doing it thematically, but between the countries, is a better way than doing national and then trying to integrate. It's much harder, I think, to do national and then try to integrate it into a single transboundary diagnostic analysis. That doesn't mean to say that you can't do it that way. And in a sense, that's what the project has to decide. The project manager, the TDA-SAP development team have to decide which is the best way to go about this. Okay, we'll talk about this more later. Okay? So the TDA provides a factual basis for the strategic components. And the TDA should also be a part of engagement and consultation with all the key stakeholders from the initial TDA steps through to the development of the alternative solutions in the SAP. So the TDA, and we've talked about this a bit, the TDA shouldn't be seen as just some scientific exercise carried out by a group of scientists. This should be seen as a participatory process that engages and consults with all stakeholders involved. The SAP is a heavily negotiated document that should be endorsed at the highest level in all the relevant sectors in the countries involved. It establishes clear priorities for action to resolve the priority problems identified in the TDA. So the TDA identifies the problems, the SAP comes up with the solutions, prioritised solutions. And the TDA is going to be negotiated, there's no doubt about that. There's going to be some form of adoption or endorsement ultimately of the TDA. That goes without saying, I think. But the SAP is going to, as you know, it's going to have potentially significant impacts for a number of stakeholders, and so they all need to be engaged in the process, and you need to make sure that this negotiated document is then accepted at the highest political level that can be achieved. If it isn't, the chances are that it won't be implemented. That's the reality of this. And that's so often happened. So many SAPs get to the point where they are endorsed, but because the endorsement wasn't at the right level, you know, the Ministry of Finance or whoever, then it then is non-implementable. So, I've already alluded to them, 3 steps for the SAP. Strategic thinking step is about collaborative development of the key components of the SAP. So this is about defining a vision, setting goals, identifying potential opportunities for innovation, new ideas, new solutions, and then identifying which are the priority options and alternatives. So this is all about vision, goals, solutions, and then identifying priorities. Strategic planning is all about taking all of this information into a national and regional consultation process. So each country is going to have to then be consulted on the information from the strategic thinking step. It's also about setting strategies for implementation. How are these solutions, actions going to be implemented in each country? And it might be different in both countries, and it's often very different between projects. And we'll talk about that in a couple of days. Then about action planning. It's about taking all of this fairly raw information and then putting it into an action plan and then developing that whole strategic action plan document. And then it's into the first steps of implementation, which is endorsing the SAP, and then what are the next steps towards implementation. Okay, so there are 3 key steps.
Can you give an example of opportunities for innovation?
I don't really want to get into that at the moment, because we're going to talk about that in much more detail in a couple of days' time. But suffice to say that this is about brainstorming. It's about bringing people together that have a common interest in the project, i.e. yourselves, and then saying, okay, these are the problems, this is our vision that we've determined, these are the goals that we set, how are we going to achieve those goals? What will be some really interesting ideas, opportunities, solutions that we can brainstorm around that will meet those goals and thus reduce the problem? Key elements of the SAP. A well-defined baseline, and then there's a clear distinction between actions with purely national benefits and those addressing transboundary concerns with global benefits. This goes back to what was discussed earlier. So the SAP is going to be predominantly about those transboundary problems and about actions that have global benefits, but it shouldn't lose touch with the fact that there are also going to be a number of potential national benefits. The key, absolutely fundamental to this is the development of institutional mechanisms at both the regional and national levels for implementing the SAP. Because there's no point in producing a SAP unless there's some way of implementing it. And at the regional level, that might be the development of, quite often, which is the case, is the development of a commission or some kind of regional body, and we can talk about that in a couple of days' time. At the national level, how are you going to get these ideas that are at quite high level in the strategic action programme into national policy, legislation, regulation, etc.? And that's absolutely critical to this process. And another key element of SAP is this whole area about monitoring and evaluation. So it's monitoring and evaluation to measure the effectiveness of the outcomes of the process. Now, this is an absolute fundamental requirement of the GEF, the Global Environment Facility, but also, in any strategic planning process, there needs to be good indicators of success. So you need to be thinking about this fairly early on in the strategic action planning process. Okay, is everybody happy with the process so far? Okay, so what I'm going to